The auctioneer barely slowed down for the last lot because everyone in the room had already written it off. Parcel 7, the hill ground, 41 acres off the Culp estate, steep, rocky, no-tillable bottom, sold as is. Do I hear a bid? A pause that wasn't really a pause. Anybody at all. He had his gavel half up before he finished the sentence. Faye Dutton raised her hand. Sold. 4 seconds, start to finish. Somebody near the back laughed. Not cruel, just certain. The sound a room makes when it watches a person overpay for nothing. Marlon Estes, who farmed the flat bottomland below the hill and had come to pick up the good river acres that went earlier, turned in his chair to see who'd bought the rock pile. And when he saw it was the quiet gray-haired woman nobody knew, he shook his head and turned back around. There's one at every sale, he said to the man beside him. Buys the view and calls it a farm. Faye signed the papers and drove out to stand on the thing she'd just bought, 41 acres of steep stony ground rising off the valley floor, brush-choked and useless by every measure the room understood. But what none of them knew, not Marlon, not the auctioneer who'd all but apologized for making them look at it, was that Faye Dutton had spent 4 seconds buying the one piece of ground in the whole sale that she'd recognized the moment she saw it, because she'd spent 40 years learning to read exactly this kind of hill. She was 63, and to the valley she was a mystery in a paid-off truck, an older woman, no husband anyone saw, no family name that meant anything, who'd shown up and bought the hill nobody wanted. What the valley didn't know was where she'd spent her working life. Faye had never owned an acre before that day. She'd been hired help her whole career. A vineyard hand, and then a cellar worker, and finally a vineyard manager out west 40 years on other people's slopes, pruning other people's vines, making other people rich off ground she'd never own a foot of. She knew wine grapes the way a blacksmith knows heat. And she'd come home east at the end of it with her savings, and a thing she'd been looking for her whole life without quite admitting it, a south-facing rocky hill with sharp drainage and poor thin soil, in a valley that had no idea what it was sitting next to. She'd learned to read a slope from a man named Gus Merrick. Gus had run the vineyard, where Faye started at 23. A stooped old winemaker with dirt permanently in the creases of his hands. And he'd taken a young woman that everybody else used for cheap labor and taught her instead to see. He'd walk her up the worst ground on the property, the steep rocky part the owners wanted to bulldoze flat, and press a handful of stony dirt into her palm and tell her the thing she'd carry the rest of her life. Flat ground and fat soil grow lazy fruit. Faye make a vine reach for it, thin dirt, hard rock, a slope, and it'll give you everything it's got. Comfort grows nothing worth drinking. He meant it about grapes, and he meant it, she understood much later, about people, because Gus had been making something reach its whole life too. When he died, Faye was 50, still working slopes she didn't own. He left her almost nothing, because he had almost nothing. He left her his pruning knife, a worn folding blade with a hooked tip, and a handle gone smooth and dark from 50 years of his grip, the tool he'd taught her to prune with. It rode in her jacket pocket every working day after that. It was in her pocket the day she bought the hill. Everyone in the valley knew the Culp Hill was worthless, and by their arithmetic they were right. You couldn't run a plow across it. You couldn't hay it. The soil was thin and full of rock, and it dried out fast and grew nothing but brush and cedar. To a valley of corn and bean farmers who measured ground by what a tractor could do on it, 41 acres of steep rock was a joke with a tax bill. To Faye it was the best terroir she'd stood on east of the mountains, and it took her most of the first year to prove even to herself how right she was. She spent that year the way Gus would have, slow, on foot, learning the hill before she planted a thing on it, and clearing the brush off the steep south face that first autumn, hacking back 60 years of cedar and bramble. She found the thing that turned her certainty into knowledge. Under the brush, running across the slope in long broken lines, were terraces. Stone terraces, hand-laid, dry-stacked walls holding the hillside in level benches. old, older than anyone living, tumbled now and buried, but unmistakable once she'd cleared them. Somebody had built them by hand 100 years and more ago. And along the top bench, gone wild and woody, and half strangled in the brush, but alive, were grapevines. Feral, ancient, surviving on their own for generations, the rootstock of a vineyard that some family the valley had forgotten, had planted on this exact hill, because they too had come from a place that knew what a rocky south slope was for. The hill had been a vineyard before. It had been waiting under the brush for someone who could read it. Faye did the legal work careful, the way a woman who'd never owned anything does. Clean deed, clear title. The terraces and the old vines hers beyond question. And then she started at 63, alone, to bring a hillside vineyard back to life, propagating cuttings off the surviving old vines, because vines that had lived wild on that slope for 100 years had already proven they could take its winters, restacking the fallen terrace walls, stone by hand. The valley watched her build stone walls up a rock pile, and decided the gray-haired woman had bought herself an expensive way to go broke. The doubter with a real stake was Marlon Estes, whose flat bottomland wrapped the foot of the hill, and who'd wanted the Culp Hill himself, not to farm, but to strip for the gravel and fill in it, cheap, to sell. He came up the track that first winter in his good truck and didn't get out. You know that hill's got no water, no soil, and a grade you'll roll a tractor on, Marlon said. I'll be honest, since somebody ought to. You paid for a gravel pit, and you're planting a garden on it. When you've had enough, I'll take it. I can use the rock. Save us both the trouble. He named a number lower than she'd paid. It's not a gravel pit, Faye said. It's a vineyard. It was one before either of us was born. Marlon looked at the terrace walls she'd been stacking and shook his head at her the way the whole valley did, and drove back down to his flat, rich bottom, certain. Faye stood on the terrace with Gus's knife in her pocket and said the old man's line to the slope. Make a vine reach, and it gives you everything. Then she went back to her stones. The setback came the second summer, and it came at the young vines she'd propagated off the old ones. The things she'd let herself love, because they were Gus's teaching and the forgotten family's planting and her own whole life's hope, all rooted in the same thin dirt. A brutal dry spell hit in the young vine's first full summer, the very drought the flat-ground farmers feared, and Faye watched her new plantings on the exposed slope wilt and yellow in ground that held no water and by design never would. She had no irrigation up the hill. She'd meant the vines to root deep and dry farm the way Gus's best always had. But they were too young, their roots too shallow, and in the killing heat they began to die back down the terraces one by one. Weeks of propagating and a season of stonework browning in front of her. She hauled water up the grade by hand, 5 gallons at a time, an old woman on a rock pile in the heat. And it wasn't enough, and she knew it wasn't. That night, she sat alone on the top terrace as the sun went down, Gus's knife open in her hand, and the old man's line came back to her, turned all the way against him. Make a vine reach. She'd made them reach, and they were dying of the reaching, and Marlon Estes was right, and the whole 4-second auction room was right. And a 64-year-old woman with no family and no acre to her name, until now, had spent it all on a hill that killed the one thing she'd planted. She'd given her whole life to other people's slopes, and the one time she'd tried to grow something of her own, the reaching had broken it. She didn't sleep. But she'd knelt beside Gus through enough dying vines to hear, under the grief, what he'd have actually said, which was never you asked too much of them, but always did you ask it right. And she saw it, sitting on the terrace in the dark. She'd made the young vines reach before they had anything to reach with. The old feral vines survived the slope because 100 years had sent their roots down through the rock to water no drought could touch. Her babies had no such roots yet. Gus's whole method wasn't deny the vine. It was deny the mature vine and carry the young one until it can carry itself. She'd skip the carrying. She'd been so proud of dry farming the way the old man taught that she'd forgotten he babied a young vineyard for its first 2 years like nothing else on the place. She changed everything the next morning. She ran a simple drip line up to the young vines, just to get them through establishment, weaning it back a little each season the way Gus actually did. So the roots would still be forced downward, but wouldn't die before they got there. She let the mature old vines reach and carried the young ones until they could. The survivors came back, and the ones that had reached deepest, hardened by the very drought that nearly killed them, came back stronger than any vine she'd ever grown on comfortable ground out west. The verdict came a few years on, and it came the way Gus would have wanted it to, not from an appraiser, but from a glass. By then, the hill was a vineyard again, terraced and green up its south face, the old forgotten planting brought back to life, and the young vines rooted deep in rock and bearing. Fay made wine the small, careful way, in a cinder-block building at the foot of the hill. And the first vintage worth showing she entered, quietly, under the plain name of her hill, in a regional competition, a blind judging where the labels are covered and the wine is all there is. Established valley operations entered it. Big flat-ground vineyards with real money behind them entered it. The panel gave the top award to a wine none of them could place. Off a producer none of them had heard of, and when they uncovered the bottle it was Fay Dutton's, grown on 41 acres of rock that had sold in 4 seconds because no one else would raise a hand. The judges, when they came out to see the vineyard that made it, stood on the terraces and understood immediately, the way Fay had understood in 4 seconds, the thin soil, the sharp drainage, the south slope, the deep-rooted struggling vines. The very things that made the hill worthless for corn made it extraordinary for wine. The wine tasted like the hill, and the hill was like nothing else in the valley, and that was the whole secret the price tag couldn't tell. The number that followed was the kind that sends farmers to their calculators. Fay would have laughed at anyone who called it a windfall, because she'd earned every root of it stone by stone. But wine grapes off a top hillside terroir are worth per acre many times what corn is worth per acre on the best bottomland in the county. And an award-winning small production wine sells for a figure that made the flat-ground farmers who'd pitied her sit down with a pencil and work out, and not believe what 41 acres of worthless rock now earned against their 200 acres of prime. River bottom. The hill nobody bid on had become, acre for acre, the most valuable ground in the valley, which brought Marlon Estes back up the track, and this time he got out of the truck. He stood on the terrace and looked at the vines and the stone walls and could not find the thing he'd come to say. "I wanted to strip this for gravel," he said finally. "I offered to take it off your hands for less than you paid." "You did," Fay said. "I couldn't see it. Not any of us could." "No reason you would," she said. "You farm flat ground for a living. It's a different eye." And then, because Gus Merrick had not taught her to grind a beaten man down, "Your bottom land wraps the whole foot of this hill, Marlon. Same rock runs into your lower slopes, where you can't grow a decent bean anyway. There's more vineyard in this valley than my 41 acres if anybody wants to learn it. I've got no children to teach it to. I'd rather show it to a neighbor than take it to the grave." She let it sit, no edge in it. "I'm not going to hold the gravel talk against you. You were seeing what you were trained to see. I just spent 40 years being trained to see something else." Marlon didn't have an answer but a handshake, which from a flat-ground man was nearly an apology. And within a few years there were 3 hillside vineyards in that valley, one of them planted on the rocky lower slopes of Marlon Estes' own land, ground he'd farmed around and cursed his whole life. The good spread the way it does. Fay's little winery gave steady work to 4 people in a valley short on it, and put the valley's name on a wine list for the first time in its history. And every fall the hill filled with folks come to pick, who'd never have believed the rock pile was worth a boot up its grade. That was the vintage the valley stopped calling it the Culp Hill, and started calling it Dutton's. Fay kept Gus Merrick's worn pruning knife on the sill of the little winery where the afternoon light hit it, and she pruned with it still. every winter. An old woman moving slow down the terraces some long-gone family had built for a purpose only she'd been able to read. Some evenings she'd stand on the top bench in the last light with a glass of the hill's own wine, looking down at the flat, rich valley that had laughed for 4 seconds and then reached for its calculators. And she'd say the line the old man left her, the one that had turned out to be true about the vines and the hill and the whole shape of her life. Make a vine reach, and it gives you everything. Comfort grows nothing worth drinking. The hill had been made to reach, thin, steep, stony, hard, and everyone who measured ground by comfort had seen only the hardship and priced it at nothing. But Faye Dutton had spent 40 years learning that the struggle is exactly where the worth comes from, in a vine and in a life both, and that the ground the whole world writes off is so often just waiting on the one person who can read what a price tag never could. If you've ever raised your hand for the thing everyone else wrote off and seen in it what the price tag couldn't tell, tell us about it in the comments. We read them all. The moral pours out as plain as the wine. Worth isn't in the easy ground or the fat soil. More often it's hidden in the hard, steep, stony places the world has already dismissed, waiting on someone with the eye to see it and the patience to make it reach. A price tag measures what a thing looks like. It never measures what a thing could become. Tell us where you're listening from tonight and about the person who taught you to see worth where everyone else saw waste. If this story found you, share it with someone standing at the foot of their own rocky hill, wondering if it's worth the climb. And whatever hard ground is yours to work right now, may you have the eye to read what others can't, the patience to let it reach, and the quiet joy, some evening, of raising a glass to the very thing they sold you in 4 seconds, because no one else would raise a hand.